Good morning, my dear friends. What a lovely day the Lord has offered us. Let us thank Him for every gift of life He is providing us today, and let us keep our communion with Him closer. Sometimes we have a curious question in our life. How could God's grace as well as sin or vice dwell in the same heart? Is it possible that the grace of God that brings so much of peace and joy in our heart, can the same heart also allow sin and everything against God's grace dwell simultaneously? That is possible, and one of the church fathers, Pseudo Macarius, offers a beautiful image to explain how these two things can exist in the same heart. He offers an example of water in a vessel, and you put firewood under that vessel and start heating it. More firewood is put in the fire, the vessel heats, and water in the vessel boils. It is something similar. When we feed our heart with God's love and we read His Word and meditate beautiful things of God's creation, what happens? The fire of God's love is, your heart is filled with God's love and the warmth of His presence, and everything good in our heart is so alive. So the beauty of God's presence in our life is so physically experienced. You feel it. The immediate presence of God, His peace, His love, all the virtues that flows from God is in your heart. That means you are keeping all the positive graces of God's presence in our life alive. On the contrary, if we neglect doing all those spiritual things we can do to keep God's grace alive in us, then we are so negligent. We are totally immersed, not necessarily being involved in material life is bad, but the only thing we desire to do is that and neglect our spiritual relatedness with God. That means our grace and the presence of God in our life dwindles. That means the power of God to be active in us is less and less. That is our personal choice. We make it. So what happens? The power of material life takes over our heart, and therefore there is ample chances that we yield to the power of sin more easily. Thus, we need to think about God knows the depth of our heart. He travels down to the inner depth. At the same time, sin has the power to travel deep into the depth of our hearts too. So, in order to allow God's grace to travel deep into our hearts, we have to work really on it too. The less we work on God's grace to be active in our life, the more sin can take, the darkness and the absence of peace that can take over the place of grace. So we have to be very conscious. Every day work on how the grace of God can be active in our heart. So that God's peace, His love, His abundant presence can really envelop and embrace our hearts, that we give less and less chance for sin to take hold of our heart and bring darkness instead of peace and joy. We have to be conscious of this so that our hearts are always filled with God's grace and love. That should be the goal of all of us. I wish you the best of God's grace and love in your life today and every day. God bless you. Have a nice day.